Does any state have an online portal for VDAs, or do all initial contacts with the state usually start with a letter?
They don't necessarily have a portal, but they do have an online way in which you can submit the request.
Okay. So
Yeah.
I'm either going to go online and submit a request,
Yeah.
or I'm going to send a physical letter into the state.
Yeah.
Okay.
Either via email, fax, or snail mail.
Fax?
Holler. Yeah.
Does anybody
still
listening know what a fax is? Anyway, I don't want to digress. So step one is making contact with the state.
Hello, you are listening to the Saltcast by Peisner Johnson, the sales tax people. And for the last 30 plus years, we have been providing sales tax solutions and peace of mind to everyone we talk to. So before we get started, I found a couple of sales tax memes that I want to share. So those watching the podcast will get a treat here. See if this resonates with you guys at all.
Yeah. There's no need to pay taxes where we don't have a physical presence. Dope. Yeah, that's not true.
Typical reaction.
Yeah. It's like me when I'm on a conference call with a client, they tell me that, and I'm like, oh, brother, here we go. Another one of these guys.
All right, so here's another one. If you're a fan of Parks and Rec, like I am.
I have no idea how sales tax works. At this point, I'm too afraid to ask. Oof.
I could say been there, done that, but am there doing that. We see that quite a bit. Yeah.
Truth.
So yeah, going along that vein, people, I'm sure you guys just told me that that's kind of a reaction you get is people are like, you know what? I have no idea about sales tax, but I know I've got some sales tax issues, but I'm kind of afraid what I'm going to find. And today's discussion, to segue into today's discussion, we're talking about VDAs, which is a way to come into compliance with the state in a voluntary way. So you're voluntarily disclosing information, and would love to get your guys' take on what determines that this is going to be the next step, and then maybe kind of the steps that it takes, and we can see where the discussion goes from there. But yeah, if you guys could talk on those points.
Well, maybe the way you segue into that discussion is, Paul, maybe you could answer, why in the world would anybody voluntarily disclose sales tax that they didn't collect? I understand sales tax that you did collect, and maybe you weren't registered properly to remit it, but why would anybody? Why is this an answer we give our clients? And it's not uncommon that this is the answer that we determine. This is a recommendation that we make, but why?
Yeah, for sure. Some people will call them VDAs. We sometimes will call them VDPs, Voluntary Disclosure Programs, Voluntary Disclosure Agreements. Each of the states are aware of them as a voluntary disclosure process of some sort, depending on how the state establishes them. But yeah, it is a common recommendation for clients to enter into a voluntary disclosure agreement, because there are a lot of advantages and disadvantages that we'll talk about today on the podcast. But it allows for a company who has exposure or has been in the state for a while, doing business, either collecting tax or not collecting tax. It allows them to come forward in a manner in which the state agrees to waive historical tax obligations, penalties, and interest that are beyond the statute of limitations. And so it allows for the company to get into compliance with the state rather than, and be proactive about it, rather than waiting for an audit, waiting for the state to come knocking on your door to collect the tax or impose upon you as a business that tax, penalty, and interest, because you've been failing to comply with your responsibility to collect and remit tax in their state. We talk about it time and time again, right? Step number one is, do I have nexus in the state? Because once nexus is established, now you've triggered the responsibility to collect and remit the tax on sales made to customers in that state. And so as we help clients through this process, alert them of their responsibility and then help them get compliant. Well, some of these clients have had the responsibility for years and years and years, and they're just unaware. Like the meme, they just don't even know about it, or they don't even want to talk about it, or they just want to bury their head in the sand and pretend it's not there. And well, now it's time to face the music. It's where the rubber meets the road, and you've got to address it. And there are other options other than a voluntary disclosure agreement, but this one is certainly one, and one that we recommend quite often because of the advantages and disadvantages of them.
Not knowing about a sales tax responsibility, a responsibility in a particular jurisdiction. Typically we're talking about states, but we could be talking about a local jurisdiction as well. Not having the knowledge of that nothing about sales tax gets better if you ignore it. Am I accurate there?
Agreed.
So we call sales tax a margin killer because the tax that you might owe at a particular percentage out of your own pocket that could have been collected from a willing customer at the time of the transaction, had you understood you had that responsibility, is often taken out of your own pocket plus penalty plus interest. You could be paying between 20 and 40%, depending on the state or the local jurisdiction, on sales made over an annual period or even over a 5-year period or a 10-year period, right?
Right.
If your margins for your company are 10%, you've wiped out your margin for however long you haven't had a registration to be able to collect and remit that tax. So every month, every quarter, every year that you're not getting educated on what your footprint might be or what your responsibility might be across the entire U.S., across all states, and even some local jurisdictions in a few states. The problem only gets worse if it's ignored or not dealt with. And so one of the we've talked about on other podcasts, what are some remedies to get compliant? And we're always interested in trying to mitigate that out-of-pocket tax dollar or penalty and interest. One of the ways, as you just described, is entering into a voluntary disclosure agreement. So a question I have about VDAs, does every state that imposes a sales tax offer some sort of voluntary disclosure program, as you call them, VDPs?
Yeah, there is in every state a program or a similar program to where you can voluntarily come forth and clean up the past. Some of the states will require you to do that by providing your information before. Most of the states, it's just on an anonymous basis. But there are ways in which you can enter into an agreement with the state to clean up the past. And the state's willing to work with you. Obviously, it's another taxpayer, more tax revenue that the state's going to receive. And so they're willing to negotiate with you on historical tax responsibility and what that may look like, depending on your facts and circumstances.
So the good news here is every state has some sort of a process, a program, or an agreement for people who come forward voluntarily, which has some benefits to it, either how far back they look or require tax payments. Maybe they waive the penalty, maybe they waive the interest, maybe they waive both, or some of both. So there's some benefits in that regard. And almost every state allows you to do this on an anonymous basis. There are some states that require you to give your name and your information up front before they'll enter into an agreement with you allowing for some of these benefits. The other thing that remains anonymous in VDAs is the process. So we talk a lot about VDAs. We talk a lot about their benefits. We talk about them as a remedy, and we enter into a lot of VDAs on behalf of our clients
Yep.
and taxpayers across the country so that they can get compliant and get up to speed. But the actual process remains anonymous sometimes to the general public. So maybe today we could just talk about what is the actual process of
Yeah.
entering into a voluntary disclosure agreement. And we know that it can be different from state to state, but there are some general guidelines that are followed across almost all states. And it's just going to be a handful of states that might have some different processes. But how
Right.
do we even get started with VDA?
Well, I would start with just identifying that there's probably 5 or 6 basic fundamental steps of a voluntary disclosure process or agreement.
I'm going to hold you
That
to that. I'm going to count as you go.
Okay, that first step would be contacting the state, whether that be anonymously or disclosing your information to the state and then
Number
presenting the
one.
facts. Agreed. Numero
Okay.
uno. So you got to contact the state. Most states, not every state, as with sales tax, every state is different and not all things are treated equally amongst the states. But in most states, you're going to submit an initial request anonymously to the state, letting them know the fact pattern. Hey, I've been in your state, been doing business X amount of years. I have X estimated amount of tax due, and I want to come clean. I want to come forward and disclose that and report that if you're willing. And so the state
So
does a
step
little.
number one is contact the state.
Uh-huh.
I
Yeah.
can't call them. Do I just call them
Request
up?
it.
Say, hey,
No.
I'd like a VDA.
No. No.
I can't send it on social media. So it's
Many of
either
the
going to
states
be,
don't even have a phone number you can call the VDA department. They don't even want to talk to you on the phone.
so I might have to type or print a traditional letter
Yes.
to send to the state. Does any
Yeah.
state have an online portal for VDAs, or do all initial contacts with the state usually start with a letter?
They don't necessarily have a portal, but they do have an online way in which you can submit the request.
Okay. Okay. So
You know
I'm
what?
either going to go online and submit a request,
Yeah.
or I'm going to send a physical letter into the
Yeah.
state.
Yeah.
Okay.
Either via email, fax, or snail mail.
Fax?
Holler.
Wow.
Yeah.
Does
That
anybody
States still
makes
use
sense
listening
more.
fax.
know what a fax is? Anyway, I don't want to
Facsimile.
digress. So step one
Yeah.
is making contact with the state. And because you want to do that on an anonymous basis, you often are utilizing some sort of a trusted advisor or
Yeah.
a firm like ours to
Yeah.
initiate that request. So that request would be on our
Yeah.
letterhead on behalf of the
Yeah.
client. And it would
Yeah.
disclose some general information, not the name of the client, except in a couple of states, but
Right.
it would just some general situations that are going on to
Correct.
alert the state that there's
Yeah.
a company out there that wants to enter into one of these agreements. Okay.
You got it.
So step two.
Step 2, you're going to wait for the response back from the state. You're going to receive that response back from the state, either at A, that they need additional information, or B, that they're in agreement based on the fact pattern. And then here is the agreement, the actual formal agreement to enter into the VDA.
That's going to happen same day. I'm going to get a reply from the
Oh,
state same
no.
day.
Oh, no, no, no. That process, once you submit the initial request, it could be a week or two that you get a response from the state. It could be in some states, I mean, it's upwards of like 6 months in some states because they're so early.
Wait. Let me just, I want to clarify this because what I'm
Yeah,
asking is step two is we're simply waiting for a response back from the state. We send in a
right,
letter or we
right.
do an online submission.
Yeah,
The state's going to send back some notification. We
right,
got your letter. They're going to acknowledge that you're wanting to enter into
right.
VDA. And they may need some additional information or they're going to have some next steps, what needs to be done
Yeah,
to accomplish that. But that second step, you're saying, now I want to hold you to this because you're
yeah,
saying there are some states out there that response could be 180 days
yeah,
from
several
the date
months.
that you actually submit it.
Yeah,
So it could be anywhere from a week
3
to
months.
several weeks to
Yeah,
multiple months. But
yeah.
what do you think the average is? What's a standard?
I would say 30 days or less.
Okay, so for the most part, because I don't want to I don't want to
Yeah,
scare people away from
no,
submitting a request to do this, but um, on average, it's probably within 30 days that you would get
yeah,
some sort of response back from the
yeah.
state.
Because that's one of the big concerns, right? If you're a business in the state and you're coming forward to the state, so you submit the request, you want to get an agreement in place sooner rather than later, because if you get audited or contacted by the state, you get a questionnaire submitted. I mean, once you are contacted by the state or the state has record of contacting you, then more times than not, your VDA isn't valid anymore. You can't do
Okay,
a
that's good
VDA.
information.
So if
Until you have an agreement written by the state, signed by you and the state, you're not you're not in an agreement, and the state is not
correct,
obligated to allow any of the benefits that are
correct.
extended through those agreements. So,
However, because you submitted the request and you have proof that the request has been submitted for a VDA, if in that time period, whether it be the next day, the next week, the next 2 months, and you're waiting for that response back from the state, should they contact you, we have been able to work with the state to allow for the VDA still because of uh,
Hmm.
the transmission
okay.
happening. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you can beg mercy
Yeah. Hey,
that
we've contacted the
hey,
state.
we started this process knowing the
Right.
situation.
Right.
And the state does not have to honor that, but what we
Correct.
find is they typically do, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
they're
this
willing
is someone
to.
who's trying to correct things.
Exactly.
But that is good information that you're sharing, um, because people do need to recognize that if the state makes contact with you first, you're unlikely in most states. There could be a couple of states where you could negotiate some sort of an agreement, but in most
Right.
states, the result is you're ineligible
Well,
for that agreement.
that's part of the process, and part of why it takes a bit for the state to respond back is because they're doing their due diligence on their end to see, hey, did we contact these guys? Have we audited them in the past? Have we sent them a notice that we are aware of them? Have we made contact by any stretch, by any means with this company before we enter into this agreement? Because if we have, then we have grounds in which we can go audit prior to and get everything. And so they don't want to, lose out on opportunity by entering into an agreement where they've already started the process.
Gotcha. Well, let me get some clarification on what you're saying right there, because in most states we're going to make a request anonymously, so they're not going to know who the company is.
Right.
We're waiting to the step two is we're waiting for information back from the state.
Right.
So maybe we should move on to step three, because at some point you are going to have to reveal who you are.
Correct. And that's
Right.
when you
Okay.
submit the either the application or the agreement or whatever that next step for that specific state is to get something binding in place.
Okay. So I'm going to submit a letter or request online. I'm going to get some response back from them. I'm not getting in that response, I'm not getting their stock agreement with what they agree to waive or what the look back period is. That's just now where we're going to begin. They're going to give a list of things that they require. Maybe it's an application,
Right.
or some other
Registration
documentation
or yeah.
that needs to be provided. Okay. So
Yeah.
step three then, I guess, and kind of an aggregate, what is that?
Step 3 is when we typically will start submitting all of that information to the state. Here is the company name, the federal ID number, here's the application, or here's our portion of the VDA agreement that you guys have. And then we submit that back to them, where they then do some due diligence at that point as well, to confirm whether or not they're going to move forward, sign the agreement on their side, and then send it back to us. So it's kind of a bundle, if you will, of depending on the state. In general, you're going to get from the state some next steps, and then you're going to compile all of that information, provide it to to the state in order to enter into that agreement. Sometimes
Okay.
it is, here's our stock VDA agreement, or here's our stock VDA language and agreement. If you're agreeable, here's what we'll do. And so you sign it and provide us this information. You provide it back to them. They do some more due diligence. And then if they're agreeable, they sign it and send it back to you. And now you're
So
officially
these are
on
real
good terms.
agreements that are signed by a company, by a taxpayer, and countersigned by the state,
Yeah,
which stipulates what the benefits are going to be, or
right,
we call them benefits because there's some reduction in
right.
fees and penalties, et cetera. But this is just, these are going to be the parameters of the agreement.
Yeah,
And those could contain the time period, waivers of penalty, waivers of
right,
interest, if that's possible. It
right.
could also, um, it can indicate other things, right? Other
Yeah,
parameters.
the state will also
Can you claim a
indicate,
refund? Can you be audited?
yeah,
All of these agreements or promises that are made, not just by the state, but also made by the company, the
yeah,
taxpayer.
by the taxpayer. The state may also indicate in their timeline of what this VDA period will cover, what that look back period is. They may also indicate a due date or a deadline that all of this has to be completed or done by. Hey, we want this wrapped up in 30 days and we got to have X information by this date so that we can bring this to a conclusion. Because at some point you're going to become a registered taxpayer and have a filing responsibility and remitting tax going forward. And so you want to make certain that the state is aware, the VDA department specifically is aware of what's going to be included in that VDA, and then what you're going to do is a regular course of compliance moving forward.
Okay, so we have another time frame here. Step 1, initial request. Step 2, response back from the state, which can include some additional request of documentation. Could be the actual agreement, could be an application request, could be registration.
Yeah.
Whatever they ask for, then we need to be able to reply and provide whatever they're asking for within a certain period of time.
Right.
What's the typical, what's an average time frame that the state provides to return documentation?
This initial request is usually fairly quickly, usually about a week or two.
Okay.
It could be upwards of 30 days, but
you're not getting
this
into a lot of data or
not yet.
schedules
No.
or details or anything like
Yeah.
that. You're just answering
Yeah.
some initial questions,
Yeah.
filling out some initial forms, maybe signing agreements. Okay.
Right.
So step 3 is to respond to the state's response. Initial request, state response, respond to the state's response.
Yeah.
And then at some point down the line, there's an official agreement that's
Yep.
signed and countersigned.
Yep.
And
Then once you have that
there?
agreement in place, then if you haven't already and you're working with a tax professional, you're submitting the powers of attorney or the power of attorney, and then depending on the state, maybe that registration. But once you have that agreement in place, now you're providing all of the transactional data to the state. And some states require that to be in a specific format. Some states require it to be on a return. Some states require maybe all of the sales in the state. Some states are only looking at the taxable sales in that state. And so how they want that data varies or differs by state, but it's usually in an Excel spreadsheet or CSV spreadsheet or on a return. And so when it comes to the return filing, then that's when we typically will try and work with the state to, for the prior years, can we just file one annual return or report everything on an annual return basis? And some of the states are willing to work with you in that regard, but some of the states you just have to file monthly or quarterly returns for the entire period of the VDA so that they can process those and get an accurate calculation of the penalty and interest by period. And then they'll waive that penalty and sometimes, like we talked about, the interest.
Okay, well, that can be labor intensive. So the initial
That process
request
is a
maybe
while.
not hugely labor intensive.
Right.
Wait for the response. respond to the response, which the ultimate culmination of responding to the response of all the information is to get the agreement in place. So instead of
Correct.
calling the third step respond to the response, the third step is to actually sign and countersign, enter into the agreement
Yeah.
with the state.
Yeah.
Once the agreement is in place, the state has certain requirements on providing the data necessary to, I don't want to use the word audit, but they're essentially saying, okay, give us the information that's related to the sales that were not filed
Yeah.
or taxed or
Reported or
shown.
text. Yeah.
Reported is the right word. Thank you. Um, the other thing that's interesting there is some states will require, if it's a VDA, all I want to give you is the taxable sales that I didn't tax, or the
Right.
taxable sales that I taxed
Yeah.
and I wasn't registered, so I wasn't able to give you that
To
money
report it.
properly.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I really have I have issues with that. I struggle with that. Like, why do you need all this information? But recognize that the state has certain requirements, and we've entered into an agreement with them. And
Yeah.
they're going to ask for what they're going to ask for. But that could be provided on a schedule. It could be provided in actual returns, so that is populated that way. There, to your point, there could be some additional registrations or interactions with the state just to make sure we're doing it the way they require it. It's in the format or form that they require. Even if it's an Excel spreadsheet, it still has to be in a format that state requires
Right.
to import it and review it. So that's pretty labor intensive. So is that probably the more intensive part of an agreement, is gathering that data, presenting that data, preparing the returns, et cetera. States
Right.
probably have different timelines on being able to get all of that done and
Right.
reported. Do they have hard deadlines
They
to get
impose
that
a hard
back?
deadline, but they're not so hard, meaning the states generally are willing to work with you on that. So if you need an extension of another 30 days or whatever it may be, then generally they're willing to work with you on that front.
What are
Because
we
you
talking
gotta,
about there on average?
I would say 30 days, maybe 60 days is
Really?
typically
Yeah,
when they want
that
that.
would be that seems quick to me.
Yeah.
Does that sometimes seem quick to companies that we're working with? Are they like, what? You
No,
know,
because usually before you enter into the VDA, you know what you're entering into, and you have an idea
good point.
because you did the initial assessment, or at least hopefully you did the initial assessment to even identify,
You did some sort of a
right?
risk analysis to
Yeah, risk
determine what your
review or
potential liability could be.
yeah. And so you have some idea and you have all the transactions. You're also checking exemption certificates or resale certificates to make certain that those are valid because
Mm,
you certainly don't want to pay tax on those sales if they're not subject to tax.
agreed.
So you're watching
I
those,
did not
monitoring that.
collect it when I should have collected it, and I shouldn't have collected it when I was supposed to collect it because it was an exempt sale. And now I'm paying it out of my own pocket.
Yeah,
Yeah, you
yeah.
definitely, that's like a
Ouchies.
double tragedy in sales
Amen.
tax. You don't want to do
Amen.
that. But I will say this, we've seen it happen, right?
Oh, for sure.
Sometimes we get involved late in the game and you might be working with somebody else or you might be handling it internally. And we find out that there's tax dollars going in through this agreement, which are difficult to get back. And
Yeah,
sometimes you waive your right to get them back.
yeah.
So you want to be really careful that you're only calculating and submitting dollars that are actually due to the state. So you want to know
Right,
the taxability of your sales going into that state. And you do want to understand the exempt status of your customers in that situation
right.
and make sure that you have those things on hand. But a lot of that back work is not part of the VDA, but it should be um, reviewed and understood before you enter into the VDA, so you have a good understanding of what your actual potential liability could be in an agreement like this. Okay, so you provide all of that. That's step number 4, right? So I'm just going to make sure I can remember these. Initial request, wait for the state's response, Hopefully it's not 6 months. It's more like within
Yeah.
30 days.
Yeah.
They're going to ask for some information. You can provide all of the information. The culmination of step 3 is there's going to be a signed, countersigned agreement that you've entered into with the state. The fourth
Yeah.
step is going to be a provision of all of the data via schedules or returns or other information that needs to be provided to the state to actually present the official liability that's
Yeah.
due. Okay,
Yeah.
that's step 4. So
So
where do we go from there?
as you submit all those schedules, returns, spreadsheets, whatever it may be, now the state is going to review that, process that, and they're going to come up with a tax bill. They're going to come up with the amount of tax exposure, penalty, and interest that's due. And that's the calculation of taxes due, or however you want to call that step, that they then process from their end, and then they provide that back to you. Once you get that bill, once you get the notice from the state indicating, hey, here's how much you owe, and then you review that obviously internally and just make certain that it matches what you've got,
So step 5
what
is a
you were
bill.
expecting. Mm-hmm.
Step 5 is a bill from the state. Do
Yeah.
the states ever push back on what you present? Do they ever come back and say, I'm not sure this is as much as it's supposed to be?
Not generally, no.
Okay. I
They're
could just
taking
see
what you
someone.
provide to them in good faith, right? You've come to them
Okay.
voluntarily to disclose this, and now you're presenting this. So they don't really have grounds or means or
This is
a
not your
reason to.
traditional auditor who already
Right.
has maybe a jaded idea about, your um, being forthcoming in what you're
Right.
sharing.
Right.
They're not there to audit you. They're there to just manage all of the schedules and the paperwork
Right.
and process the paperwork and
Yep.
create a bill. Okay. That's good
Correct.
to know. That's good to know
Correct.
because I think one of the fears of entering into a VDA is that really it's allowing the state to do an audit of your records. Now, you don't want to be dishonest in any way,
Right.
because if it is determined at some later point that you were, I mean, it could nullify the whole agreement. So,
Yeah, that's part of
um,
that formal
by
agreement in
penalties of
place.
perjury, just you got to be, if you're coming forward voluntarily, then you come forward voluntarily and you
Yeah.
provide the information. Okay, so now I got this bill.
Yeah.
Hopefully, this bill is somewhere in the range of what I expected
Mm-hmm.
based on all of the analysis that was done
Mm-hmm.
to enter into the agreement. And so
Mm-hmm.
uh, I guess all I'm left to do, step number 6, would be pay the bill.
That's right. You pay
Am
the
I
bill.
allowed to, sorry,
Oh,
am I
yeah,
allowed
you're
to
good.
enter into some sort of like payout agreement or installment
Yeah.
agreement, or do I have a
Yeah.
certain amount of days or
Yeah.
weeks to just make the full
Yes.
payment? All that,
Yes.
yes.
Yes. Yes. 100% yes. Depending on the state, again, you can either pay that all right then and there, bam, wrap it up in pretty bow and kick it down the field, or B, you can enter into a payment plan or payment terms, payment agreement of some kind. Usually the states will allow 30 to 60 days to submit that payment as well. Some states you can break that payment up into 2 or 3 or 4 payments. And some states will even put you on a payment plan for 12 months. You just have to be cognizant and you have to read the small print, because if you enter into a payment agreement in some states, you will then be billed the penalty and the interest. So now the voluntary disclosure, oh, now you have to pay everything. So why did I go through that VDA? Well, there's still the benefit of the limited look back period, but now you're having to pay the tax, penalty, and interest out of your own pocket because you entered into this payment agreement. So watch out for that. You don't want to get hosed
That's
or
sneaky. Have
it's
you
sneaky.
guys seen the new Wonka movie? You know,
I
the
was just going
re-envisioned
to
current
reference
Wonka
that,
movie?
as I mentioned, read the small print
Gotta read the
because I
small
just
print.
watched it for the first time. But yes, as he pulls that contract out, it's not that bad. I mean, we're being probably a little dramatic there, but the states are not trying to, sneak around with you
But
and
are they?
impose
I'm
apostrophes
kidding.
fees.
Yeah, they're just saying if it's going to take you longer to pay us, then those
We're going to
payments
impose
may
it
not
all.
be subject to the same benefits. Yeah.
Yeah,
And maybe they're
yeah,
subject to interest, but not additional penalty.
yeah,
Um, but that's definitely something to
yeah.
consider when you're
And
looking at those.
of course, you have the nuances of if it's tax collected, not remitted, the states are less likely to enter into a payment agreement. They're of the opinion that, hey, you collected this tax, we want it yesterday. Well, I can't pay it yesterday. I used that for marketing, or I distributed bonuses. I don't have that. Well, shoot. The payment process of the VDA, to wrap it up, is crucial, because if you don't and you miss the payment and you go into collections or default or whatever, well, now that VDA, the state, again, if you pay attention to the agreement terms, that VDA is now null and void. They have all your information. They have the assessment already. Now they're going to come audit you for not just what's in the VDA period, but going back to when you first established Nexus, because like we
Yeah.
talk about many times, the statute of limitations does not apply to unfiled returns or unpaid tax. So
A cautionary tale for
we will
sure.
watch out.
If you have collected tax that has not been remitted to a particular state for whatever reason, you're not registered, accounting function didn't function correctly, may I just suggest you always enter into a VDA to get those taxes remitted, because you have the tax dollars, you're going to remit those tax dollars. You could have some interest on that, but you're unlikely to have any penalty associated with that. And so you're really just getting the tax dollars that you couldn't get into the state there, but you're doing it under a protective order of sorts because you have this agreement
Correct.
in place. Now, the second cautionary tale, if you have collected tax and you have dollars in your sales tax payable account, and that account keeps growing because it's not getting remitted anywhere, don't spend that money. Don't use it for another purpose. Go get a loan before you spend that money. Get that money remitted to the state under a VDA. You do not want to be stuck with that. That comes with criminal penalties, could come with fraud penalties. You could end up paying 100% of that tax and penalty and interest if you're not careful with that situation. So you want to clear those sales tax payable accounts out, but you don't want to clear them out into other accounts. You want to clear them out to the state that they
Yeah.
belong to.
Yeah.
Um, we occasionally are working with someone that's been using what I call a set it and forget it and now I regret it technology platform, some sort of a software solution provider that is constantly sending the money into the state. And my sales tax payable account is growing. Um, did I turn on the tax? Did they turn on the tax? Did somebody else turn on the tax? Tax has
Right.
been collected, or it's being collected, and now it's being recalculated in a different way through the platform.
Right.
And we have individuals that are just at their wits' end that they have this solution out there that's just
Right.
supposed to take it off of your plate.
Yeah.
But my sales tax payable account keeps growing. And it's taxes that are not going to states where I'm actually registered, and it's taxes being collected and not going to states where I'm obviously not registered,
Right.
because I don't have a human looking at the platform, the system, the dashboard, and helping me understand what's going on and why it's doing this.
Right.
And maybe I've called them up and said, hey, we've got some issues here. My sales tax payable account is growing. You guys are supposed to be remitting taxes on our behalf.
Yeah.
Well, you could have a short-term filing frequency issue where it grows for a little bit because you're filing on a quarterly basis or whatever the case may be.
Right.
But typically the response you get is, oh, yeah, well, we can look into that, but we need you to accept this 5-figure support agreement
Right.
where we can help you out with that. Wait a
Right.
minute, it's your system that's not doing what I need it to do, or it's doing something I don't want it to do. You
Right.
can't help me without buying a support package.
Right.
I mean, we can, but it'll probably be 45 days before we can get to you. So um, keep an eye on those accounts.
Mm-hmm.
Accounting is still an incredible profession.
Mm-hmm.
And if your accounts are growing and they're supposed to be a clearing account, look into that. Something's wrong.
Yeah. Hopefully they're clearing. If they're not, we got issues.
Clear sign.
Yeah.
Very clear sign.
Well,
Thanks,
guys,
Paul. I think that ended up being 6 steps.
Let's go.
Ba-boom. Sixth
Love to
step
see it.
being, because we
6
didn't
steps.
name it, make the payment.
Yeah,
Pay the
or set up
tax.
payment terms or whatever it may be. You're going to
Yeah.
divvy
Pay
out
the
those
tax.
funds. It's time to make it rain, unfortunately.
But at least now you don't have you have the knowledge, you know what you're supposed to do, and you know going forward you're not going to have this liability looming over your head. And if it was an audit, they'd be looking way back further, and it could be a bigger headache, much longer. And so really this is going to empower you and your business to be able to move forward, make the right decisions.
Yep.
So again, Paul and Jason, this was a great discussion and something that I've always wondered. But there was one thing I just remembered. There was one question I had. Let's say someone wants to do their own VDA. They're in just one state. They've been there for a while, but they haven't been collecting sales tax. How would they submit like a letter? You know, it's going to have their address on it. How is the state going to look them up? You know?
That's the advantage of using a professional, a tax professional, because it comes from somebody anonymous. It doesn't have your, Paul at abccompany.com email address. It doesn't have your address, your physical address. It doesn't have any tie or reference to your company. People get worried that, hey, it's John in accounting that's sending this, and then they look on LinkedIn and they find, oh, it's this company, huh? Yeah, let's see if we can.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
so
you can do it. You can do it, but we don't recommend it. If you do it and then you need our help, our fee is always more than if you would have gotten us involved before you tried to do it. And the reason I say this is occasionally someone says, how hard can a sales tax registration be? We'd love you guys to do our returns, but we're going to do the registrations.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. But when you find that it's a little more complicated than you anticipated and you run into some issues and you want us to get involved, it's going to cost more because we're going to have to fix some things. Also, when we do the registration and we're going to be doing your returns, there's a real seamless approach to getting you set up, both at the state level and in our system to manage your returns. And the most difficult implementations that we have, which can be problematic because we don't charge for implementations. I think that's important for people to know. But our most complicated implementations is when somebody else did the registration. Could be the wrong tax type, could be the wrong structure, could be the wrong entity set up, it could be some information that's not flowing through the way that it should flow through. We run into complications quite a bit. And so if you want us to do registrations after you did them or do a VDA after you initiated it, our fees are higher. There's going to be time spent fixing some things.
Well, excellent. So if VDA is something you think you should consider, you can reach out to us at info@pj.tax or just visit our website, thesalestaxpeople.com, initiate a chat, initiate a meeting with us. Very easy to find us. Check out our additional resources. But guys, thank you again, and I know we'll see you on another one.
Thanks, Ryan.
Awesome.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ryan. See you, Paul.